David had always been the kind of person who looked for quiet places whenever life felt too loud. He loved nature, long walks, and empty landscapes where he could hear his own thoughts. That summer, he took a short break from work and drove deep into the desert, hoping to spend a few days alone with his camera. There was something peaceful about the silence of the desert, the soft wind over sand, the endless open sky, and the way the sunlight painted the rocks in warm colors. On his second day, David packed his backpack early in the morning, filled his water bottle, and started walking toward a canyon he had never explored before. The ground was dry, cracked in thin lines like an old painting. The air carried a warm scent of dust and wild plants. Everything around him felt calm, almost too calm, and he enjoyed the stillness as he walked deeper into the canyon's narrow paths. After about an hour of walking, David stopped to take a picture of a tall rock formation. As he adjusted the lens, he suddenly heard something strange, very soft, almost like a distant cry. At first, he thought it might be the wind echoing between the canyon walls, but then he heard it again. This time, it was clearer, like the sound of someone crying for help. David lowered his camera and listened carefully. The sound came again, slightly louder. His heart began to beat a little faster. He wasn't the type of person who ignored someone in trouble. Carefully, he followed the sound, stepping around rocks and dry bushes. The canyon grew narrower, and the echo grew sharper, almost guiding him toward it. As he turned a corner, he saw something he never expected. A few large rocks had fallen near the edge of a cliff, and beneath them, a girl was trapped. But she wasn't an ordinary girl. She was unusually tall, much taller than any child he had ever seen. Her hands were pressed against the rocks, trying to free herself. But she looked exhausted. David's first reaction was shock. Not because she looked strange or dangerous, but because she appeared so young and scared. She couldn't have been older than 12 or 13. Her long dark hair was messy, tangled with dust. Her clothes were simple, hand-woven, decorated with patterns he recognized from photographs of native communities. Her eyes were full of fear, but also hope when she saw him. For a moment, David froze, not knowing what to do. But the look in her eyes pushed him to act. "It's okay," he said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm here to help." She didn't say anything but gave a small nod. She tried to move her leg, but the rocks were too heavy. David realized she might be hurt. He dropped his backpack and knelt beside her, examining the rocks. They weren't massive, but they were large enough to trap her, and too heavy for her to push alone. David looked around for something he could use as leverage. He found a long, thick branch lying nearby, probably fallen from a tree during a storm. "Hold on," he said quietly as he slid the branch under the largest rock. He pressed down with all his strength. At first, the rock didn't move, and sweat began to form on his forehead, but David didn't give up. He adjusted the branch again, pushing harder, using the ground for support. Slowly, the rock lifted just enough for the girl to pull her leg back. The moment she was free, the branch slipped, and the rock fell back into place with a thud. David quickly helped her sit up. Her ankle was swollen, and she winced in pain. But she managed a small, grateful smile. David pointed to himself and said, "David." The girl hesitated, then pointed at herself and said, "Naya." Her voice was soft, but clear. He smiled gently. "Nice to meet you, Naya." She tried to stand but nearly fell, so David held her arm to support her. She was taller than him, which surprised him again, but her gentle expressions made him feel calm. She didn't look threatening in any way, just lost, injured, and scared. The sun was getting lower, and David knew the temperature dropped quickly after dark. Walking back to his cabin with her injured leg would be slow, but leaving her alone was not an option. He motioned with his hand, pointing toward the direction of his cabin. Safe place. Food. Water. Help. He used simple words, hoping she would understand. Naya looked at his hand, then at his face, searching for any sign of danger. After a moment, she nodded. David gently supported her, and they began the walk back. It took almost twice as long as usual. The path was uneven, and Naya limped heavily. But she did not complain. Sometimes, she would point toward distant mountains, saying words David didn't understand. He guessed she was talking about where she came from. When they finally reached the cabin, a small wooden place David rented for the week, Naya looked at it curiously. David opened the door and helped her inside. The cabin was simple. A small table, a bed, a few shelves, and some supplies. To Naya, everything looked unfamiliar, but she didn't seem afraid. David brought a bowl of water and a clean cloth to wash the dust from her hands and face. She watched him carefully, but allowed him to help. Her ankle looked painful, so he wrapped it gently with a cloth bandage. "There," he said softly. "Better?" Naya touched the bandage and nodded. She then pointed at her chest and said, "Thank." Her English was limited, but her gratitude was clear. David offered her some food, bread, fruits, and water. She ate slowly, as if unsure if she was allowed to, and he motioned that it was okay. As she ate, he observed her quietly. Despite her unusual height, there was nothing frightening about her. She seemed calm, thoughtful, and very young. When she finished eating, she walked limped toward the cabin window and looked outside at the moon rising above the desert. Her eyes softened with worry, as if she was thinking about her family. David sat on the chair, unsure how to comfort her. He wished he knew her language. He wished he knew how to tell her that she was safe. Suddenly, Naya walked to his backpack, hesitated, and then took something from a small pouch tied to her waist. She placed it on the table in front of him. It was a tiny handmade necklace made of wooden beads and a small feather. David looked at it, surprised. "For me?" he asked. She nodded slowly. He placed his hand over his heart and said, "Thank you." Naya smiled for the first time. A small but warm smile. The night grew colder, and David gave her a blanket and let her rest on the bed while he took the chair. Naya lay quietly, her eyes slowly closing. But before she fully slept, she whispered one word in her language. David didn't understand it, but the tone sounded peaceful, almost grateful. As he sat there, watching her finally sleep, David felt a strange sense of responsibility. He didn't know who Naya was, where she came from, or how she became trapped, but he was sure of one thing: he had to help her get home. The desert outside was quiet again. But inside the cabin, a new story had begun, one that David could never have imagined when he woke up that morning. He didn't know that tomorrow would bring visitors towering figures who were already searching for Naya, and he certainly did not know that the choices he made today would lead to a life-changing moment waiting at his doorstep. The night settled quietly around the small cabin, bringing with it a gentle coolness that softened the heat of the long desert day. David lit a small lamp on the table, giving the room a warm yellow glow. Naya lay on the bed wrapped in a blanket, but her eyes remained open, watching the shadows move across the wooden ceiling. Even though she had escaped danger, she seemed uneasy, as if her thoughts were far away. David noticed she wasn't sleeping. He sat on the chair near the table, keeping a respectful distance so she wouldn't feel uncomfortable. He didn't know much about her, but he understood one thing clearly: she was worried. Her quiet breathing, her long looks out the window, and the way she held the handmade necklace around her neck told him everything he needed to know. She missed her people. He gently tapped the table and spoke softly. "It's okay. You're safe here." Naya looked at him, her expression softening. She didn't understand every word, but she understood his tone. She nodded once. Slowly, hours passed in calm silence. The desert outside was peaceful, and the only sounds were distant coyote calls and the occasional gust of wind tapping against the cabin walls. David prepared some warm water and handed it to Naya after making sure it wasn't too hot. She took it with both hands, sipping slowly. The warmth seemed to comfort her. David pointed to her ankle with a questioning look. She moved it gently and gave him a small sign with her fingers, showing it was a little better. David felt relieved. Even if they couldn't speak the same language well, simple signs made communication possible. After drinking the warm water, Naya sat up straighter on the bed. She looked around the room again, observing everything carefully: the shelves with canned food, the camera bag on the chair, the map hanging on the wall. Her eyes stopped at the map for a long moment. She raised her hand and pointed at it, curiosity shining in her expression. David stood, took the map down, and brought it closer to her. It was an old desert map, showing mountains, canyons, and old trails. Naya touched a part of the map with her fingertip. Near the far northern area, she said something in her language, a soft phrase, but David couldn't understand it. However, he guessed that might be where her people lived. "You want to go there?" he asked slowly, pointing from her to the map. Naya hesitated, then nodded. David smiled gently. "Tomorrow. We go tomorrow." She stared at him for a moment, reading his face as if checking for honesty. When she saw his sincerity, she relaxed a little, her shoulders lowering. Trust was slowly forming between them. The night continued quietly. Naya finished the water, then placed the cup carefully on the table, showing her respectful nature. She pulled the blanket around her and looked again out the window. The moon was full and bright, lighting the desert with a silver glow. Naya's eyes softened. She whispered a few words, not to David, but to the moon. It sounded like a prayer or a hope. After a while, David spoke gently. "Do you want to sleep?" She shook her head lightly. Instead, she touched her chest, then pointed toward the desert, repeating the same soft words as before. The sadness in her voice was easy to understand. She was thinking about her family. David wished he could take her home right then, but the darkness outside was too risky. The desert was not completely safe at night. Animals, deep cracks in the ground, and sudden cold temperatures made it dangerous. He pointed again at the window and then at the bed, showing that it was better to rest now and leave at sunrise. Naya understood. She nodded slowly, even if she didn't feel sleepy. To help her relax, David took out his camera and showed her some pictures he had taken earlier: sunsets, wide landscapes, and birds. Naya watched with growing interest. Each time she liked a picture, she touched the camera screen softly, almost in wonder. Technology seemed new to her. She looked at the camera like it was something magical. David laughed quietly when she reacted with surprise to a picture of a close-up lizard. He made a gesture like the lizard crawling, and Naya smiled a small smile, but a real one. That small smile made the room feel brighter. For the first time since he found her, she looked less afraid. After some time, Naya gently handed the camera back and pointed to the moon again. She then pointed to herself, then to the sky, as if explaining something. David tried to guess her meaning. "You like the moon?" he asked. She thought for a moment, then nodded, though it was clear she had meant something deeper. She used more hand gestures, touching her heart and then pointing far away. Maybe the moon reminded her of home. Maybe her people believed something special about it. David didn't know, but he didn't push her to explain. Some things only needed understanding, not words. Eventually, Naya's movements slowed. She lay down again, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. Her breathing became calmer. David thought she had fallen asleep, but then she opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Home," she whispered in English. It was one of the few English words she knew, and she used it carefully. David nodded with a warm expression. "We will find your home. I promise." Quote, those words seemed to give her comfort. She finally allowed her eyes to close fully, drifting into sleep. Her face relaxed, and for the first time, she looked peaceful. David sat quietly for a long while, watching over her like a guardian. He thought about his day, the strange cries, finding her trapped under rocks, discovering her unusual height, her bravery, her gentle nature. Everything felt unreal, like a story from an old book. But she was real, sleeping right there on the bed. He wondered what kind of people she came from. How tall were they? How had they lived hidden for so long? Why had she been alone in the canyon? And would her family be looking for her right now? He didn't know that the answer to his last question was yes, Very much yes. Outside in the quiet darkness, several large footprints marked the sand near a distant hill. The prints were deep, larger than any human footprints he had ever seen, and three giant shadows were moving slowly across the desert, following a trail that only they understood. Those shadows were getting closer to David's cabin with every passing hour. Back inside, David covered himself with a spare blanket and leaned back in the chair. He closed his eyes but didn't sleep deeply. His mind stayed alert, listening for any sound that might signal danger. Before dawn, he woke up to find Naya already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed. She didn't move much, only watched the sunrise through the window, her eyes full of hope. The soft golden light fell across her face, making her look strong yet gentle at the same time. David stretched, rubbed his eyes, and smiled. "Good morning." Naya gave a tiny nod. She pointed again to the map, then toward the door. She was ready. David prepared water, packed some food, and checked Naya's ankle again. It was still swollen, but she could walk slowly with support. He helped her stand, and she steadied herself with determination. She wanted to go home, no matter how long it took. Before stepping outside, Naya picked up the small handmade necklace she had given him last night and gently pushed it toward him again, insisting he keep it. David placed it around his neck respectfully. Then he opened the door. A cool breeze touched their faces. The desert was silent, but not for long. Just as they stepped out, the ground beneath their feet trembled slow, heavy vibrations, like footsteps approaching from far away. Naya froze. She knew that rhythm. David looked around in confusion. And then, rising over the horizon, three enormous figures began to appear, walking steadily toward the cabin. The chiefs had arrived. The day was about to change everything. David felt the soft ground shake beneath his boots. At first, he thought it might just be his imagination. Maybe he was still half asleep from the long night. But the trembling grew stronger, steady like a heartbeat that didn't belong to the earth. He looked at Naya, who stood frozen at the doorway, her eyes wide and fixed on the far horizon. "Naya," he whispered. She didn't answer. She didn't move. Her breathing became slow, almost shallow, as if she was trying to listen to something only she could understand. The morning sun revealed the desert clearly. Sand stretched far into the distance, golden and calm. But cutting through that calm were three large moving shapes. At first, they looked like shadows shaped by the rising light. Then they grew clearer, taller, and more solid. David's heart tightened. These were not ordinary people. They were giant figures, tall, broad, and proud, with long strides that sent small clouds of dust swirling around their feet. The closer they came, the more details became visible. Each one wore traditional clothing decorated with symbols and handmade patterns. They carried carved staffs and wore feathers in their hair. Their faces were strong, serious, and unreadable. David's mouth went dry. He had never seen people like this in his life. Naya finally moved. She stepped forward, her blanket slipping slightly off her shoulders. Her lips trembled, but not from fear, from relief. She let out a soft sound, something between a breath and a quiet call. It wasn't loud, but the three giants heard it instantly. They paused mid-step. Then, all three began to walk faster. David could see it clearly now. They weren't approaching him. They were approaching Naya. When they reached the cabin, they stopped only a few feet away. Their shadows fell over the small wooden building like tall trees blocking the sun. David felt tiny in their presence, but there was no feeling of danger, only a powerful sense of respect. Naya stepped forward, wobbling slightly on her injured ankle. David gently held her arm so she wouldn't fall. The tallest of the three chiefs immediately noticed her limp and let out a deep, emotional breath. His face, once stern, softened. His strong arms opened wide. Naya broke into a run, or as close to a run as her sore ankle allowed. She went straight into the arms of the tallest chief, who lifted her carefully as if she weighed nothing at all. He held her tight against his chest, whispering something in their language, words filled with relief, warmth, and comfort. The other two chiefs stood close, watching with grateful expressions. One touched Naya's hair gently, checking for injuries. The smallest of the three, though still far taller than any normal man, placed a hand over his heart as he looked down at David. David didn't understand the words they spoke, but the emotions were clear. They loved Naya deeply. She wasn't just a member of their tribe, she was someone important to them. After a long moment, the tall chief holding Naya gently set her back on her feet. Naya pointed at David immediately, her eyes bright but serious. She said something quickly in her language, gesturing toward him, her hands expressing urgency and gratitude. The chiefs followed her gaze and turned their attention to David. David swallowed hard. His chest tightened as all three giants looked at him. Their eyes were steady and thoughtful, not threatening. Still, their presence was overwhelming. He felt like a small child standing in front of wise elders. One of the chiefs stepped forward. He had long black hair tied with a strip of leather, and his clothing was decorated with beads shaped like small moons. He spoke, his voice deep but gentle. "You help Naya." The words came slow, but understandable. David nodded. "Yes. She was hurt. I couldn't leave her alone." The chief looked at Naya again, then back at David. His expression changed, something like respect showed in his eyes. "You save her," he said again, placing his hand lightly over his chest in a sign of honor. David didn't know what to say. He simply nodded again. "I did what anyone would do." But even as he said this, he knew it wasn't true. Many people might have walked away out of fear. Many would have run home instead of helping someone so different. The chiefs understood this too. Naya limped toward David and stood beside him, as if she wanted her family to know how much she trusted him. She pointed again at her injured ankle, then pointed to David, explaining through gestures how he had freed her from the rocks and carried her when she struggled to walk. The smallest chief let out a thoughtful breath. The tallest remained silent, but his expression was full of deep gratitude. The third chief, the one with the feather staff, stepped forward. He looked at David closely, studying every detail not in suspicion, but in curiosity. "You good man," he said slowly, carefully choosing his words. "You help child of tribe." David blinked. "Child of tribe?" The chiefs exchanged a glance. The tallest one placed his hand gently on Naya's shoulder and said, "She, daughter of Big Chief." David stared at Naya in surprise. You're a chief's daughter?" Naya lowered her eyes shyly, but nodded. Everything suddenly made sense why she was being searched for so desperately, why the chiefs had come, why their expressions had been filled with fear when they first saw her injured. David stepped back, unsure what to do next. He didn't feel worthy of this moment. He had only done what he believed was right. But to these people, his kindness had meant something huge. The chiefs began speaking softly to one another in their language. Their voices were serious, but calm. Naya listened carefully, her eyes shifting between them and David. Whatever they were deciding seemed important. After a short discussion, the tallest chief came forward. He lifted his hand, gesturing for David to step outside the cabin and join them in the open space. David hesitated for a second, but followed. The desert morning was cool and quiet. The chiefs stood in a circle, and David faced them, feeling like he was standing before an ancient council. The tallest chief spoke first. "We see you," he said, placing his palm over his heart. "We watch you. From far." He pointed toward the hills, indicating they had been searching all night. "You make no harm. You give help. You give food. You give safety." David nodded slowly, listening carefully. Then, the chief continued. "We talk." He gestured to his companions. "We make decision." David's heartbeat picked up. A decision? About him? He didn't know whether to be nervous or grateful. Naya stood beside her father, watching quietly. She had a hopeful look in her eyes. The second chief, the one with moon-shaped beads, stepped forward. "Our tribe, not open to outsiders," he said carefully. "Long time we hide. Long time we stay quiet." The deserts were wide and endless. People walked past their lands every year, without realizing a secret community lived so close. "But you," he continued, pointing gently at David, "you find child. You protect child. You respect, child. David felt a warmth in his chest but said nothing. He didn't want to interrupt. Finally, the chief, with the feather staff, stepped forward with a strong, steady voice. For this, we give honor. He tapped the ground softly with his staff, as if marking a special moment. David's eyebrows rose. Honor? The chief nodded. Honor and trust. The tallest chief then extended his hand toward David, palm open. It was a gesture of welcome, rare, powerful, meaningful. David slowly placed his hand over the chief's enormous palm. It felt like placing his hand against a warm stone. The chief spoke in a careful voice, choosing each word with deep respect. You friend of our tribe. David's breath caught. This was no small thing. Even he could understand that. The chiefs were not finished. The one with moon beads added, More. We offer you permission. David frowned slightly. Permission? The chiefs nodded together. You may visit our home, the tallest said. David blinked in shock. An invitation? From a hidden tribe? For an outsider? Naya smiled at him softly, her eyes shining with gratitude. The decision was not just surprising, it was life-changing. The moment felt heavy with meaning. David didn't know what to say, but his heart knew what to feel: deep honor and quiet awe. Just as he opened his mouth to thank them, Naya stepped forward and placed her small hand on his. Whatever the next part of his life was going to be, he knew it was going to be extraordinary. And it had all begun with a single choice to help someone in need. David stood quietly, trying to process everything that had just happened. The warm desert wind brushed across his face as he looked at the three giant chiefs standing before him. Only a few hours ago, he had been alone in the canyon, taking pictures and enjoying his peaceful break. Now he was being offered something he knew very few outsiders had ever experienced: trust from a hidden tribe. Naya held his hand gently, as if reassuring him that he did not need to be afraid. Her father, the tallest chief, placed a large, steady hand on her shoulder and then pointed toward the distant hills. They wanted him to come with them. David looked toward the mountains rising far away, covered in early sunlight. He had no idea what waited beyond those rocky peaks. Part of him felt nervous, unsure if he was ready for a journey into the unknown. But another part of him, curious, grateful, and brave, wanted to follow. He looked at Naya, and she nodded at him softly, as if saying, It's safe. You can come. David took a deep breath and finally nodded. The chief seemed pleased. They stepped aside, making space for him to join them. David grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked toward them. The moment his foot touched the trail beside theirs, he felt as if he had stepped into a different chapter of his life. They began walking. The chiefs moved with long, steady strides. Even when they walked slowly for David's sake, their pace was impressive. Naya walked between her father and David, sometimes leaning on both for support. Her injured ankle made the journey difficult, but she refused to stop. She wanted to reach home, her real home. The desert stretched before them like a golden ocean. David had walked through the area many times in the past, but this time it felt completely different. Walking beside the giants, hearing their deep voices as they spoke softly in their language, and feeling their protective presence made the land seem alive in a new way. As they walked, David noticed how carefully the chiefs watched the environment. They knew every sound, every shadow, every wind movement. At one point, the chief with the feather staff raised his hand, stopping the group. He listened silently to the faint sound of sand shifting. After a few seconds, he nodded and continued walking. As if confirming that everything was safe, David was amazed. These people understood the desert better than anyone he had ever met. After some time, Naya spoke a few soft words to her father. He listened, then turned to David and repeated slowly. She say, Thank you for stay. Siao. 1. David smiled. Of course. I couldn't let her go alone. The chief nodded with approval. You heart good. They continued their journey until the land around them began to change. The dry desert slowly gave way to a narrow path between two tall cliffs. The wind grew cooler, and shadows stretched across the ground. The chiefs walked with confidence, knowing exactly where to step. David followed closely behind, feeling excitement grow inside him. Finally, they came to a hidden opening between the stones. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a narrow gap, but once they stepped through, the view widened into a valley beautiful, unexpected, and alive with color. Green plants covered the ground. Tall trees stood gently swaying in the wind. A small river flowed softly through the valley. It was like discovering a secret world, protected by nature itself. David stared in amazement. Naya watched his reaction and laughed lightly. The first joyful sound he had heard from her since the day he found her. Her father nodded proudly. "Our home," the chief said. David could not believe his eyes. He had lived near the desert for years, but he never knew such a place existed. It was peaceful, quiet, and full of natural beauty. It felt untouched by time. As they walked deeper into the valley, David saw huts made of wood, clay, and stone. People tall like the chiefs and Naya came out of their homes as they approached. When they saw Naya, many gasped in relief. Mothers covered their mouths, elders raised their hands in greeting, and children ran forward with happy cries. Naya's mother rushed toward her, tears shining in her eyes. She lifted her daughter gently, checking her face, her hands, her ankle with soft, worried touches. David stepped back, giving them space. Their reunion was emotional, loving, and full of quiet strength. After hugging her daughter tightly, Naya's mother looked at David. She stepped forward slowly, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. She placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. David copied the gesture, hoping it was respectful. She smiled softly. More tribe members gathered around. David felt nervous, but their expressions were welcoming. They whispered to each other, clearly surprised to see an outsider standing among them. Some pointed at the necklace around his neck, the one Naya had given him, as if recognizing its meaning. The chief spoke to the tribe, explaining what David had done. Though David couldn't understand their language, he understood the tone, respect, appreciation, trust. Soon, two young men brought a small wooden seat and placed it near the riverbank. They gestured for David to sit. Naya sat beside him, smiling proudly. The chief stood behind them, watching the tribe with calm authority. An elder stepped forward. She was tall, with long white hair braided neatly down her back. Her eyes were wise and kind. She looked at David for a long moment before speaking softly in English. "You helped child of tribe. We honor you." David felt a wave of humility wash over him. "I just did what I felt was right." The elder nodded, pleased by his sincerity. "You not only help," she said slowly. "You protect. You stay. You respect." She tapped her chest gently to show the importance of that word. The tribe murmured in agreement. "And so," the elder continued, "we give you gift." She motioned toward one of the young men, who brought forward a beautifully carved wooden box. He opened it, revealing a handmade bracelet, woven with strong threads, and decorated with tiny stones and feathers. The elder lifted it carefully. "This is sign. Sign, you friend of tribe. Sign, you welcome." She placed the bracelet on David's wrist. David's heart felt full. "Thank you. I'm honored." Naya beamed proudly, happy that her people accepted him. The chiefs then stepped closer. Naya's father spoke once again. "You help today. We help you, any day." It was a promise, a strong one. As the tribe slowly returned to their tasks, some people came to greet David, offering him food, water, and friendly smiles. Children stood a little further away, shy but curious, whispering about the man who had rescued Naya. Naya stayed close to him, translating simple words through hand gestures and expressions. At one point, she pointed to the mountains and said something that sounded like an invitation to explore one day when her ankle healed. David nodded happily. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. The valley changed colors, glowing golden, then orange, then soft pink. It was peaceful, quiet, and unbelievably beautiful. David felt like he was standing inside a dream he never wanted to wake from. Eventually, it was time for him to return to his cabin. The chiefs prepared to guide him back to ensure he reached safely. Naya limped forward and handed him a small woven bag filled with fruits and herbs as a gift from her mother. "Friend," she said softly. David touched the bracelet on his wrist and smiled warmly. "Friend." The chiefs led him through the narrow stone passage and out into the open desert again. When they reached the place where he had first met them, they stopped. Naya's father looked at him one last time and said, "You may return. Anytime." David nodded. "I will." With that promise, he walked back alone toward his cabin, the stars lighting his path. Every step felt different now, filled with meaning. He had gone into the desert seeking peace. Instead, he found a hidden world, a brave young girl, and a new purpose he never expected. He knew this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a friendship that would last a lifetime.